Hi, everyone. Welcome back for another episode of Auto Heterophiles. Today, I'm here with Barefooter to talk about his experience with autogynephiliia. And yeah, thank you for coming on the channel, Barefooter.
Yeah, you bet. My pleasure.
I was thinking a good place to start. I mean, often I start chronologically, so I was
hmm
wondering if, what are some of the first sort of life experiences, like thoughts or behaviors you had that you can, in retrospect, attribute to autogynephilia?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think more like concentric circles at this point rather than chronologically. But I mean, those are related. My um, feminine embodiment fantasies really go all the way back as far as I can remember, further than I can remember. I think it became a poignant. Like I came to recognize there was something wrong with it around the time of entering into school. But my parents were very open minded, and I would play with dolls and have kind of. I remember going as a witch at Halloween at like 4 or something, um, and then I don't specifically remember when like shame entered the equation, but it was just as spontaneous and natural to me, like as the desire itself. And I've really come to look at it, within that center circle. That's like the piece that I was most conscious of, is this desire and shame were both um, spontaneous and really deep and and pervasive emotions that I experienced. And underneath that, I think, is um, neurodiversity, some kind of neurodivergence. I'm probably on the autism spectrum. I've just been evaluated, but I don't know. I don't have an official diagnosis yet. Maybe next week. But uh, that's something that's it. I was able to kind of like work with my strengths to cover my weaknesses through school, lots of school, and continuing on through doctoral work. But then getting out in the real world, have had problems functioning in normal society, and noticed that my daughter has similar patterns in terms of how she relates to her body and her emotions and her imagination, and in conflict and relationships. So that's posed some questions. Um, and then sexuality, as a something that I really did not want to think about. Like, again, part of that, what I just experienced is desire, shame, and nothing that I ever wanted to talk about, think about, acknowledge as a part of my experience. Um, I have an ambivalent feeling about auto heterosexuality, AGP. Like, it's fine. When people are talking about it, it's great. But like, for me, it just has always felt so existential and pervasive and connected to other things. My therapist has been suggesting that the language of like um, asexual, or a dysphoric asexual, which didn't it's grown on me a bit, um, but not terms that I would have applied to myself, because like part of my it wasn't just the content of my sexuality that was disturbing to me. It was the very fact of its existence. And um and you know I was at one point uh attracted to women, or and I remember that emerging at puberty, and that being disturbing to me in its own right, and probably my sense of moral repulsion at the fact that my own sort of inclinations would change how I interact with other people probably fueled kind of an autosexual tendencies. Um, but yeah, I mean, and I guess that's my synthesis of Freud and Thomas Aquinas, is just like recognizing how pervasive this is, to say that the um, the generative aspect of the soul is necessarily implicated and activated in all identity formation. And so it just goes very deep, but and was always a part of me, right, and how I experience myself in the world. But always very cognitive because of how deep the shame was around it. I didn't really, like, maybe once or twice I did cross dress, but like not a normal part of my experience. It was all very um, overwhelming, immersive fantasies that became sexualized around puberty, but they were already present before then. And then kind of um, later on, kind of reading erotic fiction, getting into some like online role play, and like it would just keep emerging and like merge with other thoughts and just a constant part of my subconscious or unarticulated world, right? And yet be disturbing to me at the same time, right? So that's what I kind of identify as my core experience, and it's timeless, right? So
Uh, yeah, did you the stories you mentioned, the erotic stories, was it like transgender transformation stuff?
yeah, very transformation oriented for sure.
Yeah. It has that stayed pretty constant, or has it, like, sort of evolved over time?
Um, yeah, I'd say it's evolved over time. I'd say, yeah, very anatomical and cognitive in its expression. So um, that's just where my interest gravitated. It was before I, you know, discovered anything in terms of that. Oh, there are other people who have. Well, I don't know. I didn't think about other people, right? Obviously, there's an implicit community in the fact that I can find people who write things that appeal to me. Um, but but like this was my own kind of elaborate imagination. I guess that really shaped my consumption. Like obviously, there's a lot of overlap between um, AGP media or transgender media and other kinks, and those things just never appealed to me. Even the stories themselves, like I was always kind of zoned in on anatomical transformation was kind of like my primary gravitation when it came to engaging with the media. So
Yeah, you also mentioned that it was sort of also, in addition to anatomic, um, cognitive in its expression. Like,
yeah, yeah.
what do you like, what does that mean?
I would say, immersive daydreaming is a big thing. And
Okay.
that was actually kind of the primary expression for me. And then the way in which, it would just kind of, I would not even realize that I was thinking about it. And then, like I don't want to be thinking about this, but or the way that I would kind of take in and process information. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm gesturing towards. But like I think that's part of the difficulty for me is it was so ephemeral for most of my life. Um, that's just really hard to name, to talk about. So I kind of look at that whole core of my experience as being, cloaked in hiddenness, both because I never found the courage in my formative years until a couple of years ago to even begin to try to talk about anything in there with another human being, right? And also I didn't have language for it, which is maybe a more neutral framing. Like those two things together kept that cloaked in hiddenness, a sense that like I can never be seen here, I can never be known here, I could never be loved in this aspect of myself. And and yeah, that's that's a lot to carry. And I think the next layer out for me was just like living with a lot of fragmentation and compartmentalization. Um,
How did
so
you, encounter like, you said you didn't have language for it at a certain point.
mhm, yeah,
How did you encounter like, how'd you figure out about autogynephilia, and then how'd you feel about it when you did?
yeah. So um, way back in like 2008 or something, when I was in seminary, I guess that's part of my expectation with this is like, okay, well, I expect marriage will fix me, right? And
Classic, yeah.
yeah, um, and it didn't. It's actually kind of remarkable given my own, I guess what I now recognize as being asexual tendencies, right? That I got married in the first place, but it's part of a friend group, and that's what we all did. Um, I look back at how I comported myself. I still comport myself in a relationship with my wife, and it's like, oh, this is remarkable. that this happened at all. But that was part of my expectation going into marriage, is that the problem would go away, and of course it didn't, and that was really confusing and challenging. So we'd been married about a year, and then I was in seminary, and I was like, okay, what do I do with, how do I begin to name this? How do I begin to work on this? I felt like this was, again, with the shame, with that, and the depth of that. Like, I felt like it was something I really needed to reckon with, and I tried. And that's when I did some thinking about, rather than just being immersed in that dimension of my experience. It was really kind of like, again, very compartmentalized, Jekyll and Hyde. I didn't consider this to be a part of me. It was just something that I gave it whatever space it needed, and then did not acknowledge even to myself, much less to anyone else, that this part of me existed. But I tried for a season in seminary to name it enough to disclose to my wife and to bring it into confession. And yeah, it was not. I mean, that's when I, did some work online, and I countered autogynephilia, and that just kind of made sense for me at the time. Also, cross dreaming, that was another language. I preferred autogynephilia just because, I like Greek as a language, and so I appreciated that.
Did
Kind
you
of
come up
having a
with a
name
word
for it.
before you encountered that?
No, I didn't. I didn't really. No,
Okay, I just figured I'd ask.
yeah, I didn't have. I didn't like to think about it. I didn't like to step outside of the experience to think about it or acknowledge it. So, um, and I guess that, yeah. So I briefly engaged it at that point, and accepted that was the name for my experience, and continued with that. Um, and like it worked for a little while, just to have it named, but then I felt like I had dealt with it, and I didn't talk about it again. Like, I told my wife, and then she kind of processed that, and we moved on, and it kind of crept back in. I got more and more vague in my confession, and then it was just kind of done, right? And things would crawl in through other, because it was so cognitive, again, like, I wouldn't even necessarily recognize when it was kind of creeping up on me, and then I'd be in all kinds of, again, just like mental scenarios. It's very easy to move from one to another. So that, it kind of, I guess that it over time became more consuming, more kind of intrusive, um, and more compulsive, particularly during periods of high stress. Um, and I think that, yeah, about 2 years ago, I think, yeah, online role play was something that kind of came in later, and that was very much, again, just Jekyll and Hyde. I was fully compartmentalized. I didn't want to acknowledge this aspect of myself, and yet, like, what kind of role play am I playing? Like, I need a character. Now, the character started blank, but then as I would be in regular conversations with people, like, what do I draw from but what I know, and who I am, and just kind of remixing that in the sort of like these various feminine personas that I created. And it was really disturbing from an internal perspective to feel like, oh, these feminine personas feel more like me than I do. And then also at one point, I had a long kind of correspondence with a trans woman. We talked about all kinds of stuff, just philosophy and religion and art and music, and at some point after a few months, she's like, "Yeah, we're the same." Like, I know that this is a persona that you have, and you should really work on that. And I was like, "Oh, well, I guess that's true." And at that point, I began to kind of accept being trans as a hypothesis that made sense of my experience. And along with that, I quickly discovered that, you know, being AGP was not okay for a lot of trans people. And I again,
Yes.
like I say,
Yeah.
my own ambivalence to the term um, is rooted in the fact, like you know, um, it doesn't fit quite right. Like I recognize, you know, sexuality is obviously a part of the experience for me. Um, I think for some people it's less obvious, but but exactly how do we talk about how that relates? I think it can be very personal. I think that's part of the issue, and the existential component of it um, was so salient that
But what do you mean by
it
that?
felt
The existential component?
well, that it was something that it was a yearning that sort of predated my emergence of any kind of explicit sexuality. That sexuality itself was something that was uncomfortable for me as existing. Um, those kinds of pieces. That this sort of like I guess a really deep tendency, which is probably related to neurodivergence, of dissociating from my body, um, and you know those pieces feel like they are pre-sexual or not related to sexuality, but that sexuality kind of becomes wrapped up in there as a consequential piece rather than a causal factor. So I guess that's how I look at it. It's like at some point I mapped out all of my etiological thoughts in my own experience and had like 30 or 40, you know. and AGP was one of those kind of, it's a central mechanism that drives it, but not necessarily the only one or the even the primary. So but again, like I've come, I guess what really helped me in thinking about it was recognizing that some of the things that I do I don't understand. Like I will think about it logically and like I shouldn't do this, and I do anyway. And the
Do you have any
analogy that
specific
came,
examples?
well, I mean the big example is getting on HRT. Right? Like I rationally calculated out why I shouldn't do that, and then I did it anyway. You know, I and um, the the dynamic that I related was, you know, it's kind of like um, in a sort of romance story. You see that the protagonist has the love interest, and um, and will blow up their life in interest of the love interest, despite all, you know, indications that they shouldn't do it. Right? It's like, oh, okay, so that's what this is. I don't relate really. That's I guess one of the common AGP uh, developmental trajectories is the falling in love with one's feminine persona, and like I just don't really relate to that at all. Um, Perhaps because of the cognitive piece. I guess for me, it's more an experience of finding love in my feminine persona, or like through that aspect. Um, it's not the object, but kind of it feels to me not the object of my interest, but sort of like a part of my subjective experience, which was really a necessary transition for me in my own thinking from that place of being just like profoundly hidden into being willing to work through that. Was, you know, like in the context of my own faith and spirituality, which is central to, you know, how I've navigated the rest of my life. Coming to recognize that, like, um, you know, what I proclaim to others is that, you know, Jesus died for our sins and it worked, and that he meets us in our secret garden of shame, you know, and like that's the very place in which he wants to know us and love us. And, you know, I guess I said that enough times so I came to believe it. And then, you know, that began a process for me of being willing to open up that box and start unpacking it, and find that, oh, this isn't just like a part of me that I can turn off or doesn't affect the rest of how I process information and relate with people. Like the roots and branches of it go really deep in my whole being, and it's something that I need to explore and develop my language around, and develop community around, and figure out like what does this mean, and how do I navigate this in my relationships and in the world. So that's kind of where I've come to, moving from compartmentalization, fragmentation into a place of integration, embodiment, expression, and then also navigating that, with a church career is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I imagine that's a delicate balance to strike. Um,
Yeah,
have you mentioned you went on HRT? Are you still
yeah,
on it?
I am. Yeah, I've been on for about a year, a little over a year. So
How did that I imagine you probably brought it up with your wife before doing that. How did that conversation go?
yeah, so that's part of what I'm not proud about how that unfolded. I did bring it up with her. We did talk about it when I sort of reopened that conversation from many years ago, as something that had kind of moved from being contained and not talked about to being back on the table as I was exploring, being trans as a hypothesis to uh, describe my experience. We talked about things generally. I wasn't really particularly ready to be very concrete. It was just still like that. Those habits, even feeling like I needed to move forward. Like the habits of hiddenness and shame were just so deep that it was difficult to put words on it. I still tend to do that. It's like very abstract in my thinking. I think because of the ways in which my interiority was so wrapped up in this. And so it was named, and she had kind of said, well, I support you, I'm concerned about these things. Um, and I didn't really know where to take the conversation from there. But then reading other people's experiences of HRT, once I kind of crossed that threshold into considering trans experiences, that became sort of my fixation rather than sort of like the fantasy narratives. And and then I rationally thought it through for myself, and kind of weighed the pros and cons. I counted that preliminary conversation that I had with my wife as enough. I decided that I didn't want to do it, but then I did it anyway. It's like, well, it's an experiment. I can just do it and see how it goes. And it was just like immediately like a very positive subjective experience for me. And I was like, oh, well, a couple of weeks on, I was like, yeah, I don't want to go back. This is great. um,
What did you
the
notice about
psychological,
it?
well, I mean, I would say overall, I just felt 30 to 40% better. Um, there's a psychological component to that. I think part of it must just be this, because this has been so cognitive for me, being able to say, okay, this is now grounded in material reality. I don't have to wonder what it is. It's like I can point to this specific reality of having kind of like cross-sexed hormones, right, um, as being constitutive of my experience, rather than being just so ephemeral in my thoughts. And then I think, well, also additionally, within a short span, my libido kind of fell off and matched sort of my own self perception of what sexuality ought to be, which is available but not intrusive. And that has been a tremendous relief for me. I'm ambivalent to the kind of physical changes that it brings about, because on the one hand, they're very satisfying to me personally, but on the other, when you're navigating non-presenting, it's like, is this going to become a challenge, or is this going to create problems? And it hasn't. I didn't think it would, because uh, I was like, I don't know how that would work with my just body type um, and not having any particular agenda in terms of no history of cross dressing, no particular agenda in terms of developing that as a practice. And so I wear some bulky church clothing, and so it's pretty easy to not be noticed in that. So yeah, that's what that's been like.
Yeah. And has your wife been all right with the physical changes?
Um, she is not super excited about it, but she's also not. I don't think that the challenges that we've had since our second um, are not we're existing before that. So it's something we're navigating. I think that it's been actually really good. She probably would tell a different story, but like it's been good because it's just brought to the surface a lot of things that we've not talked about. And like we're starting to work through some of the root causes. Um, so, but like I feel fairly, we've talked about it, and she's okay, and I don't know exactly how we're gonna put all the pieces together over time. Um, and I think that's probably one of the things that worries her most, is that I don't have a clear agenda or a clear roadmap to this. It's just kind of, you know, something I need to explore in that process of integration and embodiment. So
Right. And she's probably worried about the unknowns of like whether you're gonna try to socially transition or escalate in
yeah,
other ways.
yeah, and at this point, I guess I regard it as sort of an eschatological horizon, right? Like for me to socially transition would basically mean uh, at least moving churches, if not moving careers, right? So, um, and there are things that could happen in my ministry that could end it anyway. In which case, I would seriously consider it. I think I probably would socially transition, but uh, and I guess that there's a certain risk in the path that I'm on that I could get to a point where it's like I will go ahead and voluntarily make that decision. But I don't think so. Like I think particularly since my experience has deepened my sensitivity for LGBTQ plus experiences in the church, I find a lot of meaning in creating more and better spaces for grace and for reconciliation, and for like really just living. How do we create community where we're vulnerable about our you know our deepest areas of challenge and struggle? I think the church has a really bad track record when it comes to sexuality, right? And so building that into my congregation or experimenting with how can we create those conversations in a safe way for everybody from where we are, and then also working on it theologically in the context of my bigger church structures, that brings me a lot of meaning and a lot of satisfaction. It invests my whole journey with a sense of purpose that, like, yeah, it may not be the most uh, kind of like gratifying from a just embodiment angle, but that meaning itself is sufficient to sustain me at least at this juncture, um, and makes social transition feel less necessary. Um,
R
I
Right. And
do.
and you said it was mostly anatomic, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
yeah, so you might not actually like need to socially transition really, or it might not do much.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting dynamic. I've been reflecting on this a lot recently. That my um, there's a need. I have a need to be seen in this area, right? Because it's been so hidden for so long, right? That there's a sense of like this is a part of who I am that I need to see reflected in other people. And I'm figuring out exactly what that means and how. But also, I need, even for practical reasons right now, it's like I also need to keep it hidden. Um, and I don't feel the same shame, like that. I feel like has been healed, really. But my patterns are still reflecting, a lifetime journey of carrying that as shame. And so, I don't know. I expect that will be an ongoing theme of my own interior life and development and growth. So that's okay. Second half of life project, I guess.
Yeah, and I think like there's a certain when people reach a certain age, at some point they kind of run out of fucks to give, for lack of a
Yeah.
better word, and like you might just become at ease at some point, just because you're in your mid 50s or something, and that's just when a lot of males tend to mellow out.
Hmm.
Um, how do you consider yourself as having gender dysphoria, and like how would you describe it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I've gone back and forth, um, as to whether and I think at this point, yeah, I don't really know. Um, I mean, as I mentioned, I have a lot of dissociation from my body. Um, I don't know whether that's, or the extent to which that's gender related. I guess that what I do experience is that, I have a hard time carrying about being in a body at all, and that sort of feminizing practices are grounding and embodying to me. And so, exploring and cultivating those has been uh, life giving, and find that when I do that, like, that helps me. And when I don't do that, or when I feel like I can't do that, I feel kind of uneasy and irritated. So I suppose that's a sort of dysphoria. Yeah, and but it's not been acute. But then I've also been I have a tendency to really strongly dissociate. So, um, that's kind of where it lands for me.
Right, and it might be hard to figure out like is the dissociation coming from the autogynephilia, or is it coming just from your propensity for daydreaming?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
I
Yep.
mean, you did mention at one point that like the female personas that you're experiencing in your daydream started to feel more real than your like default self, and
Hmm.
I have sort of noticed a pattern that when that happens with AGPs, that they like progressively identify more with the feminine and less with their male self, and it does seem to sort of cause greater dissociation because it's like they can't even relate to themselves anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess that I experienced some of that in terms of, like, well, I've never particularly identified with the masculine. Um, in some ways, becoming a priest is a flight from anything traditionally male in a lot of ways. I think that's been it's always been part of my coping structure for my own interior chaos, and um, things about myself that I didn't know how to grapple with. Um,
Do you have like the clerical robes in your
oh,
denomination?
oh yeah, I love them.
Yeah, yeah, I bet. Like um I can recall there's one case in Hirschfeld's book from back in 1910 where one of the transvestites in it said that he wanted to pursue becoming a priest because then he'd be able to dress how he wanted underneath his robes.
Yep, I'm totally there. I
Yeah,
will confess. Yeah.
Have you
Yeah. So,
tried
I mean,
cross-dressing at all?
not in any sort of robust way. Um, for me, like my practice now, I'm very timid for for lots of reasons. I don't want to escalate. I don't have good opportunity. Like I really want my wife on board, whether or not she's into it, right? Just at least aware and like feeling like there's good boundaries around it when there haven't been in other aspects of my um, exploration. And so like that's on hold while we're working on our relationship. But I do underdress and like I think that kind of that sort of totemistic aspect of like being of having something that symbolizes the feminine with me is really helpful and grounding and just feels good to me physically. So um, I probably will more in the future, but at this point, that's the extent of my experience.
Yeah, then it sounds like it's for the best that you're being cautious about escalating it just because you got the marriage and everything.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And I think my wife has given me some boundaries, which the only hard one is no other partners. And I was like, great, I don't want to do that either. and uh and then everything else was kind of like, surgeries would be difficult, social transition would be difficult. I'm like, yep, I agree, those would both be difficult things, and I'll keep that in mind. But I feel like um we're well positioned to, as within our marriage, work through anything. But um but yeah, it's kind of the bigger, well, how does life as a whole fit together? How do I make a meaningful kind of career move if we're going in that direction? So
Right. N Yeah, like you said, it would probably really shake up your career if you were to start socially presenting in a really overt way.
yep, yeah, yeah. I mean, like I'm pretty open. I between the fact that I'm open about working on this theologically as a topic, and um, just like the trans experience in the church, because churches are still catching up um, with same sex marriage, right? And trans issues are
Yeah.
just like not even really on the radar, except that there's generally a instinctive sense of like what should be, that is enforced, right? Um, so I'm working on it theologically, and I'm open about the fact that I'm working on it theologically, and I'm pretty vulnerable from the pulpit, in terms of on a thorn in the flesh level about like what my own experience feels like, and that's actually really powerful. I don't think I've really grown as a preacher since coming out to myself. It's great. Um, and then I have made some presentational changes. I used to wear a beard, and I don't do that anymore, and my hair is a lot longer, and um, you'd think that somebody might do the math, but if they have, nobody's mentioned anything. So
Right, and I think the general awareness of autogynephilia or how to spot it, like, people don't really have a finely tuned sense of how to spot AGPs.
right, yeah.
Um, have you do you pay attention at all to, the online discourse around autogynephilia? And if so, like, what's your opinion on it?
Yeah, I mean, I do tend to um, I tend to resonate with people who are, I guess, self-aware AGP. Um, I find the, I guess, lack of curiosity or lack of willingness to um, engage honestly with some of the deeper questions about trans identity within sort of mainstream trans community to be a little bit confusing. I don't really understand why it's such a big deal. I guess I resonate in some ways, right? Like, sexuality is a difficult topic, and it's something I've always kind of fled from. And so to like, if it weren't for my own sense of being held and healed on that level of shame, I don't know if I'd be like, it's much easier to just say, well, this is only an identity issue and it's only to do with gender. So I think it's regrettable that there's so much hostility. I've never experienced hostility like that. Like, people asking questions because, you posted on this Reddit, so like, you're not welcome
Yeah.
here. Like, oh, interesting.
Oh, like
I
posting in mainstream trans Reddits and then them pointing out that you post an Ask AGP?
Yep, exactly. Yep. Yeah. Um, so that level of sensitivity is puzzling to me. But I wouldn't say that I follow it closely. My attention really gravitates towards my own interior experience, and trying to make sense of it in a way that makes sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, that is the most important part for you because it's your life.
Right, right, right. And
Um,
I think it drives my own sort of ambivalence. It's like I want to define language that works for my own sense of wholeness and integration. And it's going to be uh, like I said, the kind of synthesis of Jung and Thomas Aquinas, I think, in the long run.
w- what's your you had mentioned that you sort of preferred the self-aware AGP community. What do you like about them?
Um, the willingness to ask questions about, okay, so where, I guess the etiology question was really big for me for a long time. I've kind of since concluded it doesn't really matter, right? To be able to determine, it's like, well, I do this and it is good for me, and there's not a strong reason to not do it. I guess so. The questions are prudential, right? Where do the benefits, where do the costs outweigh the benefits, and being aware of that, and operating more with a sense of discernment rather than a sense of strong boundary. And I feel like in the self-aware AGP community, there's a greater openness to that way of thinking. Whereas within sort of mainstream trans discourse, it's just like, well, you're trans, and here's the steps that you can do, and like, you don't actually. Well, people will say you don't have to transition, but there's kind of a really strong, without a sense of a cause. There's a really strong sort of like undercurrent of I think you get carried away into like, this is just the required for your sense of wholeness and happiness for you to transition. And like, like I feel free to not live anybody else's story, right? And that's really important to me, staying there. And I don't I feel a lot of kind of peer pressure in mainstream trans places, and maybe that's me. And a lot of like, am I trans enough? Um, Whereas AGP, self-aware AGP communities tend to be a little bit more diverse in terms of where people are um, in their process of integration and how they're integrating, and I appreciate that. But like, we're all dealing with the same issues. Like, I guess the language that I tend to gravitate towards is, we're all gender transgressives, um, and there's a similar structure to the experience, and a lot of different manifestations, and a similar reception, that when people who don't have this kind of tendency and experience look at us, it's a combination of of pity and revulsion and confusion, right? Like, um,
Yeah.
and like we have some practical challenges when it comes to navigating the world, given our gender transgressiveness. And I think if we can figure out how to make that a collective project while we have different manifestations of that and different sort of like ways of interpreting that experience, like we'll all be better off if we can learn from one another, see it as a project of the community of practice, of mutual learning, rather than one of kind of like warfare between the right way of looking at things versus the wrong way of looking at things. And um, I mean, I'd love to see more of that. You know, and to be the AGP community does strike me as being more having that intellectual curiosity. Um, I'm not always sure, like the ways in which mainstream trans renders the experience, like just doesn't fully make sense to me. You know, like to be kind of like cross-gendered in one's essence or something like that. I relate to it, but I also just don't understand how that works philosophically. And
Right. It's
um,
not a satisfactory explanation.
right, right, yeah,
Yeah, um I also like how the self-aware AGP community, they do seem pretty open-minded and curious and inquisitive and also less judgmental. Um it just it even though there's some that, like in any community, there's gonna be some people that are neurotic or whatever. Um
hmm,
Overall they seem much more accepting of themselves than it seems in the mainstream trans communities.
right, right, yeah.
Um yeah. Are are there are there other aspects of your experience that we haven't gotten to touch on yet?
Hmm. Well, as I mentioned, you know, I'm spending a lot of time trying to understand myself from kind of like a theological perspective, and you know, making space for um, trans people in the church, and you know, it's, or I guess, and even just my own ways in which I think that there are a lot of people in um, in faith leadership who have deep issues of gender and sexuality. Um, that's kind of almost a trope, and um, that's a curious manifestation to me. I think that it would be good for more stories to be told of that, but like it's very sensitive to try to open up those conversations. Um,
Right.
but you know,
Um,
particularly, I think coming to recognize, like, you know, it was that part of my own sense of self, even as my manifestations of AGP and faith evolved over time, right? Those were like the two constants um, over a very kind of volatile experience of life, and you know, lots of moving around, um, just transitions, and in um, you know, as one accumulates over the course of one's life, um, and you know, that I was determined for them not to be related to one another, but they were on a very deep level, and I still don't fully understand, and am kind of obsessed at this point with mining that significance of that. So
you mentioned that you think that a lot of people in church leadership may have like various issues with their sexuality or gender.
Hmm.
Do do you think it's like what flavor of sexuality do you think it typically is? Like, is it like same sex attraction, or is it the auto heterosexuality, or something else?
I mean, I think that you know, it's difficult to it's I think for it can be different things for different people. Like, I only know my own experience with this, but for me, it's often framed from an outsider perspective of like the problem is, um, we're taught shame around sexuality, and I don't feel like it was something that was taught for me. I had a very broad Christian exposure, and like I was never, purity culture is a big thing for a lot of people of my generation. That was not my experience. But um, I did gravitate, within between affirming churches and more traditional churches. I did gravitate towards more traditional churches because I didn't want to be affirmed. This part of myself that I didn't know what to deal with, didn't know how to deal with it. And I was looking for language that would help me around, understand my existing experience of shame, and language of sin, and kind of like traditional anthropology around sexuality from Paul and Augustine and so forth. Like that resonated with me. Um, and ultimately, I find that my faith was not the cause of my shame, but its solution in finding, like that point of coming to the point of being deeply loved by God in the midst of those parts of myself that I found to be uh, unknowable, unseeable, unlovable, unredeemable. Um, and I suppose that the critique could be made that like we're, um, deepening the problem with the solution. But like I don't know, like this is just it's the language with which I see the world, and to me, um, the depth of the whole drama, is so much richer than just kind of like affirmation of the, oh, like it's not a problem. You can just, it's everything is okay, it's not a big deal. Like, no, there's something about this that even today it's like there's something about this that just, I guess I've gotten more comfortable with it, but um, other people are not always going to be comfortable with it. And to know that I am beloved of God in the midst of that, is sort of existentially necessary for me. Um, and I think that the pressure for church leaders to present a kind of perfection that other people are sort of striving for, creates a lot of energy that needs to be released somewhere, and tends to aggravate people's shadow side. And we're not particularly good at integrating, um, our shadow side as clergy. Um, it ends up manifesting in unpredictable and destructive ways, I think, for a lot of people that they then keep hidden. Right, those are some of the structures that come into place, and that I think can have lots of different manifestations. I think, I mean, I guess there's no way to really know. I think AGP is probably pretty common, um, based on my own experience. Like a lot of my own, uh, reading and orientation, there's a long tradition within the church of um, of identifying with the female in relationship to God and spirituality. And I mean, that obviously that resonated with me quite substantially through the course of my life, and I expect that that's true of other people. But it may not be. Um, Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because it's not something that people generally talk about, or there's not language around it. So,
Right. Yeah. And yeah, you saying that had me wondering, like, of the various people that contributed to the Bible, like whether any of them were influenced by like AGP. Because you mentioned like there's sort of like the relating to God from the feminine perspective.
hmm
I was, yeah, just wondering historically about how that, whether that influenced anything. But
yeah, I mean, Paul himself, as he talks about his thorn in the flesh, right, and sort of his mystical experiences. Um, I kind of wondered, but like that language is deliciously vague. You can kind of read onto it any sort of deep struggle with one's you know deepest sense of shame and brokenness. So, but yeah, I think I do tend to think that um, the categories of um, of male and female, we tend to, for whatever reason, have them be very within conservative religious contexts are very rigidly defined, and I feel like there's a lot more fluidity in the text of Scripture itself, whether that's AGP motivated or something else. I don't I couldn't say, but it resonates with me as such.
yeah, and it's like it's understandable why like I get why the more conservative vantage points would be more like polar or binary with the treatment of gender, just because it's it offers sort of a clear prescription for how the men and women are supposed to be, and it like it gives
hmm
order and structure.
Right. Yep. 100%. And that's been actually a major shift in my own thinking. Has been, this is a big part of the tradition is like everything rooted in teleologically rendered natural theology, right? So male and female is such, for the purpose of procreation, right? That's kind of like the classic basis of Catholic sexual ethics, um, and moving away from that sense of like what if our natural theology isn't teleologically oriented but eschatologically oriented? What if who we are is not how we were created but who we are becoming? And actually, like that is a much richer and more interesting way of reading the Scriptures. um, and it opens us, then the Scriptures are not about imposing an order, but like opening us up to possibilities and giving us a language to explore what it is to be the people of God who are never getting anything right, but yet loved by God and moving towards a destination that may never be realized within the horizon of history. So that's like just a major reorientation. Like I wasn't really taught to think that way, but then having come to that conclusion, it's just like this is just such a natural, more compelling, more open way of reading the Scriptures, that I find personally to be very liberating. Sharing with other people, and it also makes space for other people have different stories and different ways of integrating their experience, and that's awesome. Like that's great. Let me tell my story. Let me hear your story, and we can live together in the midst of our diversity and learn from one another in our um, differences of perspective. Particularly, wrestling with something as that's kind of niche as transgender experience and AGP, right? And like really moving towards being a community that's organized around storytelling, that's organized around our differences rather than conformity, and discernment in terms of like what really works best for you, what fits best into our community life, but how do we support one another even if we disagree? Like that's a social vision that is rooted in my kind of theology and experience, that's been emerging for me as I've wrestled with the margins of my own experience. Find I'm much more open to other people, and it's just like tremendous, beautiful growth as a human being. I'm really grateful for that, and want to encourage everybody, to take that step of looking towards the margins of one's own experience and what are the pieces that I'm leaving out of the story, and what does it look like to retell the story if we put those in the center rather than pushing them off to the side as something that just doesn't fit and can't be acknowledged. So
Yeah, and that sort of forward-looking disposition you're talking about versus the the looking towards the past, I definitely see how it has a lot more potential for influencing like how you live and see your life. Because if you were to just think of it in terms of like the world was created and there's nothing you can change about it, it just happened that way, versus the forward looking where you take actions and it changes things. It seems like there's a lot more potential looking forward.
right, for sure. Well, and that's the world that we live in too. Like we need to be responsive to the fact that our lives are chaotic and constantly changing. And if the anchor point is in something that's stable on the level of nature, I don't think that we'll ever be satisfied. Whereas if the stability is something that's beyond the horizon, that's something that we are participants in, and that we are that our yearnings are meaningful in terms of our knowledge of, or in terms of our bringing into being, or being a part of that emerging reality. Um, yeah, it seems to me just a necessary way of navigating the world that we live in. I mean, I still regard myself as a traditionalist. I just look at what some of the things that I assumed were part of the tradition as being reactionary. Being a traditional is to say, here is this heritage that I have that I'm responsible for stewardship of, and I want to pass this on to people in a way that's meaningful for them in the world that they live in, rather than kind of reactionary, which is to say, like, everybody who doesn't value this is an enemy. And like that just doesn't seem to me like a very productive posture. And to wonder, like, having the curiosity of like, well, how does this weird story that I'm living, that I've been given, make sense of my experience? How might it make sense of the experience of other people who are of different background and belief system and culture and so forth? I think the world is just a much more interesting place, but I guess that the battle mentality is very tempting. So
Yeah, people do seem to be disposed towards thinking of things in terms of war metaphors and battle and conflict.
hmm hmm
Um, when did you? I don't know if I asked. Like, what age did you first find out about autogynephilia?
Oh goodness, I would have been 22, I think.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
9 years earlier than I did.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like it was pretty early on in the conversation. Again, that was like 2008. Um, so there wasn't a lot. I don't feel like battle lines were drawn back then. But again, I just kind of touched it and then left that conversation. So
Yeah. Were you already married at that point?
yep. Hmm.
Oh, that's early, but I guess like you're saying, you're traditionalist. So
Hmm.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Yep.
Have you
Yeah.
ever encountered any women that are autoandrophilic?
Um, so self-consciously, yes, um, on in kind of online spaces. I've had some good conversations with a few people. And then also, there are some people that I've met who haven't self-identified, but I do wonder if they're um, presenting masculine and based on some of their other language of self-identification. I wonder if that's a factor, but I don't know whether that's language that they're using or whether that's language they're even aware of, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I that makes sense. Most people don't, regardless of whether they're AGP or AAP, they don't even really know the label or
Hmm.
go to the length of identifying as it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I wonder. I had for a time I worked at a nonprofit, and I had a fellow there that I hired, and I wasn't really aware of it in the years that we worked together. I didn't put together the pieces, but he'd spent a lot of time in ballet and in ice skating, and over time was making presentational changes. And I realized after he posted some selfies on Facebook about a year after we had parted ways, like, oh my goodness, seems like we may have something in common in terms of this interior experience. Uh, you know, um, we still haven't talked about it, but it was really interesting. It's very clearly, very openly and publicly kind of living into that at this point. But he doesn't narrate it, and I don't really narrate mine except to very few people, and then strangers on the internet. um, so it's interesting. I see him every once in a while, and I kind of wonder if it's going to come up, or even if it doesn't. Like, it's interesting that we sort of gravitated towards one another working together, because in some ways our minds work very similarly, and that's how we ended up working together, right? um, so I wonder about those things, because I do see, I would say, like, it's not every trans person that I really have a connect with well, but it's maybe 1 in 10, which is a lot more than like normal people, where it feels like maybe 1 in 1,000 that I or that I have that sense of natural gravitation towards. So um, yeah, I don't know.
Uh, Um, I was curious if how would you react if one of your kids told you that they thought they might be trans or that they had gender dysphoria?
I hope that I'm able to hold space for that well. I definitely, I wonder with my two kids. Again, my daughter is very similar to me in terms of her general relationship to her body and emotions and so forth. And I don't I don't think that she does, but I don't know. I don't think my parents have any inclination about my proclivities. Um, and then my son is very different, but like he loves wearing his sister's dresses, and um, he's having a hard time with pronouns. Like, he doesn't know how to gender anybody. So
You mean
I've
regardless
thought
of
about
whether
it.
they're trans?
Right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Regardless of whether they're trans, you know, he and his sister watched Harry Potter, and then they were kind of playing afterwards, and he referred to his Hermione. So um,
That
just
is
he just
funny.
doesn't understand. He'll use different gendered pronouns in the same sentence for the same person. I'm like, okay, that's very interesting. Um, so yeah, I mean, I want to be my family to be. I want my community to be a place where we could talk about these things early and often, right? Um, and but then I don't. How do you do that in a way that's also safe? I think I I don't know, right? Like
Right, it's
it's
delicate.
still, yeah, it's delicate, and it is a hard path. Like I wouldn't wish the kind of things that I've carried on anybody, and the way that it affects people who do kind of go on a path of transition, right? Like that's a lot to navigate. It's very difficult. Um, but I think that you know that's become core of my ethic in the church. Is like this is a work of double truth telling. I think we tell the truth about our physical bodies, and we tell the truth about our internal experience. And I would love to see the burden of discerning what to do about that for gender transgressive individuals taken off of the individual and put into the life of the community, discerning what does this mean. The world is not as simple or as black and white as we might like to think. Um, and inviting that more in the life of the church. Um, and, I guess thinking about it in the context of my own family, because, we haven't talked with my kids about it. I don't know how to do that in an age appropriate way.
Yeah,
Um,
are they younger than puberty?
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. So, um, I mean, that's I think a question worth asking. I mean, maybe it's as simple as just inviting myself into playing dress up with them. So,
Yeah, I mean, at that age, that's, I guess, sort of a simple way of going about it.
hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, they're at an age where it's kinda, like, not necessary to have too many conversations about that anyways.
Right. Yep, for sure.
What how do you, what's your perspective on, youth gender transition?
Hmm. That's a good question. I don't know um, that I have a fully formulated position on it. I guess looking back at my own life, if I had known at 20 what I know now, um, I'm fairly certain I would have transitioned. Um, I would just organize my life completely differently around that. Um, and I guess projecting back further, it's interesting. I mean, like again, this has been it's been fairly constant in my retrospective experience. Um, but I also don't regret anything that's happened in my life. Like there's not a huge burden that I'm carrying. Um, I feel like there are so many unknowns um, in in my sense of where things are, um, that it's really not as well supported as in terms of the research as it is in terms of the social policy, and that concerns me. But then, like, do I really know that? um, I mean, or does it really matter? Because it's like I'm not in a position to do anything about it. So um, yeah, I don't know. I guess that my perspective, or I guess where my focus is on how do I compassionately make space for the people on all sides of those situations, which are quite complex and emotionally fraught. And I think that if we can talk about things, have everything on the table, be committed to one another over difference, and walk together in love, like that goes a long way to helping people make better decisions. And that's what I feel like is in my wheelhouse and domain. The kind of bigger sort of like policy boundary level questions, I feel like are beyond the scope of what I can responsibly comment on.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Yeah, I figured I'd ask just because you never know, especially because I do think that so much of the propensity to be autogynephilic or autoandrophilic, I think it is primarily genetic. And
yeah.
so sometimes it can be a particularly like salient question if, for someone that is autogynephilic and has kids because they've probably wondered about it
Hmm.
themselves. Like, is one of my kids going to do that? And then if so, like, how
Hmm.
would I feel about it?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Do you have any opinions on like the broader like transgender discourse, like how you would like to see it change or what directions you'd like to see it go in?
Hmm. Um, I mean, it is definitely it's a very hot thing right now, and a very difficult, like an inherently difficult and complicated thing to navigate. It's made even more challenging by the temperature around the polarization, which I think is extremely unfortunate. I think in general, on a social level, I I kind of project outward from my own vision and goal for the church, which is really like having better capacity to speak the truth about our experiences, to love one another in the midst of difference, to forgive people who we think are doing things that are silly or wrong, um, and um, and building communities around that sort of mutual belonging and embrace. And that's I don't know how you do that from within trans discourse. Um, that's a challenge. I'm kind of new to this, being kind of self-identifying as on the trans spectrum. Um, I recognize a temptation to sort of just kind of like um, cloister in and find my belonging only in a community of people who understand that particular kind of experience, and then you know continue on a pathway of um, just being protected from the rest of society rather than engaged and present. Um, so um, yeah, I think that sort of openness to how do we proactively be engaged in the world? Like, what does it mean to be again like moving away from a war footing and into one of like mutual learning? Like we are all this is an emerging reality socially. Like we're gaining better resolution in terms of talking about varieties of experiences that have probably been present throughout human history. Um, and can we be curious about one another's experience rather than dogmatic? That's what I would really hope.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope for that too. We'll see if that can happen for realsies.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Uh,
I lead with that posture in my community, and like, how do I translate this? Like, what my slogan is kind of, like, we're not, the ground of our fellowship is not that we agree with one another at every point, that we approve of everything one another does or says or is, but that we're all sinners for whom Christ died. Having that sense of depth of, like, being forgiven gives me the ground to forgive others, and having that be the self-conscious reference point when I am engaging with somebody who is different than I am or is difficult for me. And going back to the story that we tell together about, we're all beloved sinners, right? Is grounding for me and helpful. And, I don't feel like somebody else has to believe that in order for me to believe it about them, right? Like, created in the image of God, worthy of the blood of Christ, like, that's true of everybody. And so I guess maybe, but that's motivating for people who share that theological framing. But like, I don't know necessarily, I don't have another story to tell for people who don't, or for people, language like, Jesus is usually okay with people, but language like sin can be really triggering. I haven't quite figured out how do I hold that well for people who need something else. Because I don't want to be the one. I want to see, robust, interesting conversations. I don't be the one like increasing the temperature in the room because of accidentally triggering somebody's trauma. So
Yeah. Um, since being on hormones for about a year, have you noticed, has it changed how much your autogynephilias is expressed as cross streaming? Like, do you still have that sort of like other parallel world going on in the background?
uh, for a while, like, it was super intense, and well, I don't know. There was, I guess that the shift for me has been much more into the existential dimension rather than sort of a libidinal. And I've been trying to locate things in the realm of meaning rather than in the realm of, well, I guess, when it's not connected to the rest of my experience, like, it's by definition not meaningful, or I'm trying to enact it being not meaningful. And so I guess that really the 2 seasons since I've been on HRT have been, one season was one of like having a lot of personas that I was developing, mostly on in a cognitive space, and then subsequently just like a lot of theological writing, ascribing the meaning more abstractly. So that's been the primary way that it's functioned for me, and so it's a very different experience, and one that I really like. I like engaging with that way. Again, like the intrusive thought dimension was really not something that really disturbed me throughout most of my life before HRT. So
Yeah. With those alternative personas, is there like a finite number of them, or would you just come up with new ones constantly?
um, so yeah, I think previously I would kind of create one and play with it for a while and then put it away and create another one later. When I was more systematic about it some months ago, there were sort of 5 that I had set on, which interestingly, corresponded to um, another set of 5 that I had made previous to that exploration. So that was interesting to me, that kind of parallelism. But yeah, I mean, so I guess both and depends on what I'm doing with them. I don't know exactly what's in store for the future. Whether that's a project that will become interesting to me again or not, it doesn't feel entirely voluntary. Um, that these interests sort of come and go, and then are very intense for a season, and then they subside, or I enter into, like, I have a new obligation that I need to attend to, and then I neglect it for a while. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's dynamic and
What
fluid. It's the problem with it being so cognitive.
what you're just describing with having those like sort of intrusive thoughts and the other personas, it sounds phenomenologically similar to a lot of what the people that consider themselves plural or having like DID might
Hmm.
experience. Are you familiar with those sort of people that feel like they have multiple selves within their self system and they like switch between them?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something I've really thought about, with my own experience. Um, I'm always aware of, um, my personas as persona. Um, I guess the
Like they
way
weren't
that one of
integrated
the
into yourself then.
right, yeah. Well, but one of the ways in which um, the ways in which I've thought about this is distinguishing between essence and persona. And I said, well, in my essence, well, I think the essence, human essence, is like, it mirrors Trinitarian language, right? The essence is fundamentally unknowable. Like, the principal function of essence, or like the deepest aspect of our essence, is, in my view, either we're under the law or we're received in love, right? And um, and so to know oneself as being truly and fully beloved in one's deepest self, and then navigating the world, and we navigate the world through our personas, um, and um, and so that deepest core of essence is expressed through personas, and the personas can be, arbitrary and multiple. Although for most people, I don't think that they are. Like, they're pretty consistent. It's a lot of work to have a fully developed persona. On the one hand, on the other hand, like, we do it all the time. Like, we just, in terms of what we disclose about ourselves, in various circumstances, differs from person to person. It'd probably be really helpful for me to think through this more systematically, just because, it's already how I instinctively navigate the world. And like, when I started reading on autism and about masking, it's like, I don't really mask, but I probably should. Like, probably get a lot out of that. I
Yeah.
just kind of do whatever, I kind of feel like at the moment, and it's like, this is kind of socially inappropriate, but I'm going to try it anyway and to see what happens.
Yeah, I'm
Like,
like
maybe
that
not.
too.
Yeah. um, Maybe not the best way to get things done in the world. It's gotten me in some trouble.
Yeah. It's it probably would be good to use more to incorporate personas in a sort of utilitarian way, but it
Hmm.
seems like it would take a lot of energy to do that.
Yeah. Right. Well, so in terms of my sort of, when I started, doing this interior work, related to sort of my own beginnings of integration, like, what I recognized is, um, I had this persona who I described as the mystic, who had the function of sort of like mediating between my essence and these external personas, who I recognize as being in a state, just through life circumstance, of being, um, very sickly and weak, and near to a point of death. And recognizing that this unacknowledged interior persona was a feminine aspect, and had this special relationship to my essence, was sort of the ground of recognizing that, oh, she has the power to sort of just like kind of recreate whole cloth from this energy that flows from my essence, my whole entire interior structure, and giving space to that, and kind of like letting her play and create all these other personas, and figuring out how to use them. But then it got to the point where that was not sustainable as an interior exercise. So, but maybe it will come back. I mean, I think I still use similar techniques, just in how I navigate day to day life.
Um, I was thinking since we've been going about an hour and a half now, it might be good to uh, end soon. And I was wondering if there's anything else you wanted to cover.
Well, I think that's a good overview of kind of my experience. Yeah, I mean, I guess I will say I am, whenever I come across trans spectrum people who are thoughtful in describing their experience, it's amazing to me, this sort of Venn diagram of like, some things will be just like, oh my gosh, I resonate with that so much, like that is totally my experience. I didn't even know there was language for that. And then other things that they will say is like, well, that's clearly integral to their experience, but I don't relate with it at all. And then there are other things that have been so essential to my own experience that don't seem to manifest for them. And so I'm really grateful for the work you're doing, and just getting stories, thoughtful stories, uh, cataloged, and kind of creating this sort of space. So I hope my own reflections, kind of meandering as they are useful in that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that you shared your opinion. Um, I usually close out by asking a sort of question, basically, like what would you say to the AGPs that are listening to this? Like, what would you want them to know?
Um, I guess integration is hard but worth it, and that, I think that the goal really is integration. Transition may be an outcome, and um, I think that it's worth the risk for just the benefit of being a whole person and not living in a compartmentalization and fragmentation. That, I think, those burdens of shame and hiddenness are the worst part of this. And then the practicalities of navigating life as a trans person, or as a gender transgressive or gender nonconforming, um, those are real, but the shame is the most damaging dimension. And so finding ways to work through the shame and then navigate life. That's what I would commend to everybody. So,
Yeah, I mean, those are some good thoughts. Uh, that's a strong uh, note to end on. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
yes, certainly. Thanks for having the open invitation.